Hello there, welcome to the Saroid channel wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. I do hope you're doing incredibly well. I hope that life is finding you very fit and strong and that you are feeling on top form. And don't forget to go and get yourself something really lovely to drink because I've got a fabulous story for you tonight. But before we get started, you know the rules. Go and get yourself not only that lovely cup of cocoa, but don't forget to click on the notification bell, the thumbs up, and of course share this story with anybody you know who particularly enjoys listening to a good story, because you don't have to be a Bigfoot fan to love the stories like these, because there's so many twists and turns to them. So before we continue, love to each and every one of you. So let's get started, shall we? Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, I had very reluctantly agreed to come to my first grief counselling session with Dr. Bernstone on the advice of Dr. McGregor, who felt that any medications that I was taking were not enough to help me overcome the dark cloud that was hanging so inauspiciously over my life, that had pretty much vacuum suctioned all the hope away from me with the brute force of a no-nonsense industrial hoover. It meant there were some very lonely, bleak, desolate days for me, when I would refuse to get out of bed, as so heavy was the weight of my despair and grief, and the profound sense of loneliness that had crippled my ability to function like a regular human being. "Look, Miss Prt1of4," Dr. McGregor had said rather pensively, "I can prescribe you all the medications in the world, but you yourself say you sometimes barely manage to leave your apartment. You struggle to get up in the mornings and even get out of bed. I am sure that you must see that this is no way for you to live. You're a lovely young lady. You have your whole life ahead of you. You're definitely suffering from PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, survivor's guilt, and a debilitating grief. The only way you're ever going to overcome this is to seek out a professional who can help you ride the storms of your grief, discuss your feelings, and help you get through the dark tunnel, so that finally you might find the light at the other end. I'm sure you must fully appreciate, Miss Prt1of4, that medications can help to a certain extent, but there is only so much they can do. They are not a miraculous cure, I'm afraid, as many of the issues you are currently facing need to be addressed psychologically. I do know the perfect trauma psychologist that can help you." "Dr. McGregor, I know you mean well. I know you do. And you've helped me so much, especially with the medications you've prescribed. I don't want to talk to a stranger about what I went through. I just don't. I'm sorry. I don't believe a grief counsellor or so-called psychologist, if you call them that, can help me. As far as I'm concerned, such people dole out their honeyed advice to their patients like sweet candy, don't they? It would seem every celebrity in Hollywood has a psychologist, from what I've heard, and a fat lot of good that's done for them. They might have successful careers in the limelight, but most are really screwed up." Dr. McGregor considered my words carefully. He nodded. "You're not wrong about that, Miss Prt1of4, but this is very different." "Is it?" I challenged him. "I don't think so, Dr. McGregor," I said, shaking my head. "A psychologist, as far as I'm concerned, hasn't got a clue what I've been through. I'm perfectly sure that such wizened professionals return home to their cushy lives at the end of a long day, after discussing things with their patients, without a single care in the world. Put it this way, I don't give a stuff how many degrees they may have behind their belts. I'm sorry, unless you've been through a similar trauma such as myself, how can you possibly be qualified to talk about somebody else's pain? They may go through the motions of claiming they understand, by acting all sympathetic and compassionate, but do they really understand anything at all?" "I don't think so," I said. "Look, Miss Prt1of4, I'm not saying that anybody can understand what you've been through. You make some very good points in regards to that. But Dr. Bernstone, I assure you, is a very, very skilled professional. He's a good man, and while he may not have experienced your trauma, He has vast experience in dealing with people such as yourself who have been through horrifying ordeals. He can help you make sense of them. Don't misunderstand me, Miss Quattro. What you have been through is absolutely devastating, and I'm quite sure you'll never really get over the grievous pain of your loss. But you can learn to live with it, to make the very best of your life, and this is where Dr. Bernstone can help enormously. Make sense of what happened to me? Are you kidding me, Dr. McGregor? How can I ever make sense of any of that? Tears splashed down my cheeks. I couldn't stop them. I was rather angry with myself for being so transparent. I really didn't want to show any emotional hopelessness or weaknesses to Dr. McGregor, but it was too late for that. My tears betrayed how lost I really felt. But perhaps it was a good thing I was crying, for I had been too numb to cry for a very long time, and I needed this release. Dr. McGregor sighed rather wearily. I imagine he was well used to a doggedly stubborn patient such as myself, that resisted his sagacious suggestions, that made his life all the more harder. He thought he knew what was best for me, and I appreciated his salient efforts to help me find my way through the billowing thick fog of my life. But how could Dr. McGregor know what I needed? All I wanted to do was to shrink away from the world, bury myself under my duvet, and never wake up. Look, Miss Quattro, I know you're very sensitive and overwrought at the moment, and I can't force you to do anything you don't want to do, said Dr. McGregor gingerly. Ultimately, it's your decision to make. I can only give you some well-seasoned advice. Let's just say I had a patient recently who lost her family in a fire. She attempted to commit suicide over 6 times. As much like you, Miss Quattro, she was very distraught indeed. I do not believe for a second that she even wanted to kill herself. Otherwise she'd have succeeded in her first suicide attempt. But her attempts to kill herself were a cry for help. Suffice to say, she is very glad to still be alive today, let me tell you. She is comfortable with me telling my patients her story, if it can help someone like yourself to learn from it. As you can appreciate, it is not ethical for me to talk to patients about any of my other patients. But she wants me to tell my patients her story, if it can help them in any way. Much like you, she was on numerous medications that failed to work. She shrank away from the world, ordered her groceries online, and never stepped out of her apartment for 3 whole years. I had to pay her a home visit, well, several of them. That's how bad it was. I persuaded her to see Dr. Bernstone, who would agree to counsel her from her apartment because she wouldn't leave it. Against all the insurmountable odds that were stacked against her, she managed to make a full recovery, to turn her life around. She cannot speak highly enough of Dr. Bernstone, and how that very skilled, humble psychologist successfully gave her life back. Let's just say she found talking to him helped her get through her grief. It wasn't a quick journey by any manner of means, as it seldom is, I'm afraid. But that patient of mine definitely gives Dr. Bernstone the credit for being here today alive and well, and she'd be the first person to recommend him to you. She lost her whole family in a fire, I asked. So there are people out there like myself who've lost absolutely everything. It really was reassuring and comforting to hear this. It made me feel as if I wasn't completely alone in this chaotic tangle of catastrophe that I called my life. I'd so often wondered why others had it so good, so very easy, and yet it would seem a wrecking ball had been thrown at my life, as if God himself had a vendetta against me. Well, sometimes it felt like that. Sometimes it felt so desperately personal. Are you telling me this patient of yours got better? I asked Dr. McGregor incredulously. You're saying she fully recovered from her grief? How can anybody ever recover after losing their entire family? I just don't get it. Your life comes to an abrupt full stop, doesn't it? How do you ever move on from there? I don't think I could do it. Every day is a relentless struggle, as if I'd been hit with a debilitating flu virus, and it takes all the energy I've got to just walk from the bedroom to the toilet, That's how bad things have got for me, Dr. McGregor."
"You are not alone feeling this way, Miss Prt1of4. Emotional stress can be equally as devastating and as crippling on the body as a physical disease can. It can suck and drain the energy right out of you. Of that I am most sure. I've witnessed it enough myself. In answer to your question, yes, this patient of mine did make a full recovery. And so can you. As you can see, her experience is not unsimilar to your own. For 3 years she refused to leave her apartment. Now she's a happily married woman, expecting her first child, with her whole life ahead of her. I saw her 3 weeks ago, and she's glowing because she's so radiant. I know she still regularly sees Dr. Bernstone, but she's a new person. She's still aggrieved by her losses, of course she is. I mean, who wouldn't be in her situation? But she's learned to accept things and move on. She's got an incredible will to live, and she says she's very grateful to be alive, as by all accounts she should have been in that fire herself, but was staying at her boyfriend's house that weekend, so she also has a sense of survivor's guilt, so to speak. She told me that if I had a patient who was going through similar issues such as herself, that she would be glad for me to speak about them to my patient. She actually encouraged me to speak to patients about her, so that they can know that there really is hope out there, and that help is available. She told me to tell people like you not to give up, because things will get better. I could give you her telephone number if you like. I know she would be delighted to speak to you."
"That won't be necessary, Mr. McGregor. I'd rather not speak to this woman, even though I do appreciate that she's been through a similar experience to me. So I'm very grateful she was willing for you to share her story with me. But you have managed to convince me, Dr. McGregor, to give the therapy you talk about with Dr. Bernstone a try. But I cannot promise you that I will stick with it. I'll go to 1 or 2 sessions with this Dr. Bernstone and see how it goes from there on, and then decide if I'm willing to pursue it."
"Well, you can't say fairer than that,"
said Dr. McGregor, wiping his glasses with a tissue and replacing them back on his eyes. He looked heartily relieved. His heavily wrinkled face appeared to brighten, and suddenly he looked as if he was years younger than he actually was. He had been our much-beloved family paediatrician for many years. When my mother was alive, she thought the world of him. She had once found a suspicious mole on her back, and as a consequence, in alarm, called so many dermatologists, begging them to see her at once, and they said she'd have to wait a few weeks for her first appointment. My mother then called Dr. McGregor. He told her to get around to the surgery at once, and he quickly removed the mole from her, and it was found to be precancerous. But that was Dr. McGregor for you. He passionately cared about the well-being of all his patients, and was less keen on recommending pharmaceutical drugs to fix problems. He was very old-fashioned like that. I could see he was resolutely determined to help me out in any way he could.
"I'm very glad to hear you say that, Miss Prt1of4. I really am. I think your mother, your late mother, would be very proud of you. I want you to make a full recovery. That's not to say you'll ever get over your losses. I'm not saying that. But I'm hoping you will acquire the tools you need to learn to live with your grief. And that in itself is a fine accomplishment. Believe me, I don't think you will regret your decision in going to see Dr. Bernstone. You will be in excellent expert hands. Of that I am most sure."
Let's just say I seriously began to regret my decision in seeing Dr. Bernstone the moment I entered that rather tall, intimidating building that stretched up into the blue sky like a tall skyscraper. It was one of these ostentatious buildings that contained hundreds of fancy businesses. I entered a large open courtyard covered with marble and took the fancy glass lift to the 25th floor. I entered a glamorous reception area where I was greeted rather formally by the posh receptionist, who gave me a professional but tight smile. "Oh, you must be Miss Prt1of4. Dr. Bernstone is expecting you. He'll see you shortly," she assured me. "Please just take a seat over there. He won't be long." As I sat in the reception area, On the elegant settee, I was far from comfortable, as I waited to be called through to Dr. Bernstone's office. My first thought was I wanted to get the heck out of there as quickly as I could. I felt as if the walls were closing in on me so tightly, on every side, so that the very breath in my lungs was being expunged from me, as if I was slowly but surely being suffocated, rather like an insect in a child's matchbox that has no air holes punched in it. My heart began to pound violently in my chest. I so nearly ran out of that reception area, as an adrenal-inspired panic surged through my bloodstream. I was beginning to sweat profusely on my brow and my hands, that had become both clammy and hot. The receptionist, sensing my discord, smiled at me warmly. It was like she could pick up my growing disquiet, and moments later she said in a chirpy voice, "Dr. Bernstone will see you now." Before I could change my mind, she gestured for me to follow her. I followed her down a small passageway, decorated with interesting contemporary artwork, that looked like it had cost a bob or two. I was finally led into Dr. Bernstone's office. "Don't be nervous, Miss Prt1of4. There really is no need for that, you know," said the receptionist kindly. "Dr. Bernstone won't bite. He's a very good man, a gentleman he is. I think you'll like him very much." She pointed to a very elegant white leather sofa, covered in a colourful array of throw cushions, in oranges, purples, reds and pinks. "I tell you what, why don't you take a seat over there? Make yourself comfortable on that sofa. Dr. Bernstone won't be very long." Dr. Bernstone's office was the antithesis of what I expected a psychologist's office to actually look like. It was warmly welcoming. I felt as if I'd stepped into a lavish Moroccan living room. It was bright and cheery. A well-lit room, with huge floor-to-ceiling glass windows that magnanimously invited prepossessing views from the street below to enter the space, so that the ethereal prisms of sunlight danced across the room in a cheery glow. The room was invitingly comfortable, and I sat back gratefully on the glorious plush sofa that seemed to swallow up my whole body. I hugged one of the purple plush cushions tightly to my chest. The office had been painstakingly designed to put, I imagine, Dr. Bernstone's patients, such as myself, at ease. It looked like a beautiful, brightly coloured conservatory, with magnanimous vases of flowers, magazines and bowls of fruit, rather than the dingy, mediocre, nondescript office space I had clearly expected. Let's just say the cosy atmosphere of the office relaxed the tension in my shoulders to a certain degree, as if I was slowly and surely being calmed down by a soothing antiseptic or a gentle massage. The office was scented with the fresh smell of lemongrass, which was coming from a diffuser that I noticed was on a polished walnut desk that must have belonged to Dr. Bernstone himself. The music playing in the background was of birdsong, which I suppose was designed to be calming. It was hard to believe that this beautiful office was located in a tall, very uptight building that was austere and charmless and gave off that professional, imposing vibe. Even though I was gently enveloped in the beautiful sofa, my body remained rigid and erect, rather like a pencil. My nervousness about meeting Dr. Bernstone was still profound, and I was still regretting having come here. The last thing I wanted to do was to confide in a perfect stranger, who knew absolutely nothing about my life. But what could I do? I was here now. I'd look like an idiot if I ran away from the officers now. Still, I persuaded myself clandestinely, after the session I had with Dr. Bernstone, I need never come back here again. Granted, Dr. McGregor would be very disappointed about that, especially if he knew I gave up so easily on these sessions. Just as I was meditating on my regrets in coming here, Dr. Bernstone sashayed breezily into the room. I could smell his very pleasant aftershave, with its refreshing citrus notes. At a guess, he must have been about 5 years older than I was, which did surprise me. Or 10 years older, I couldn't be sure. But if he was 10 years older, he certainly looked young for his age. I hadn't anticipated someone so experienced to be that young. I would say, to look at, he was definitely in his 30s, but I couldn't exactly be sure. I noticed at once that he was a very good-looking man, with blue piercing eyes that were dappled with a genuine warmth, and his blonde hair was neatly cut in a trendy style, where the hair in the front was spiked up a little, which rather suited him. I noticed he was a well-presented man. As well-presented as his office space, you could say. He wore a smart, casual look, which suited him. I was slightly taken aback with my therapist being that young. Was I really expected to pour out my heart to a man like this? I didn't think I could do it, and I was sure this counselling session was going to be a complete waste of my time and of his. Dr. Bernstone took my hand in his. He shook it warmly. His handshake was firm.
I'm Dr. Bernstone, and you, I understand, are Miss Cottrell. Miss Lisa Cottrell, is that right?
That's right.
Do you mind if I call you Lisa? He asked me.
That's fine by me, I said rather flatly. Everybody calls me that.
Dr. Bernstone took my file out. I spoke to Dr. McGregor about your case. I understand he's put you on some very good medications, but he believes they aren't helping you sufficiently. He's saying you are struggling to regain any normality in your life.
Of course I'm struggling, Dr. Bernstone, I snapped. Wouldn't you be struggling too if you lost your entire family to carbon monoxide poisoning, caused from a stupid gas leak, from a faulty boiler, in their bathroom en suite? How would you feel if that happened to you? Other people don't know how good they have it, do they? I've lost my family, Dr. Bernstone. And I'm not just talking about my immediate family, my whole family. That includes aunts, uncles and grandparents in a very short period of time. I'm completely alone in the world. Can you imagine what that's like? My family seems to have been struck down with a tragedy, as if we're living under a family curse. Do you believe in curses, Dr. Bernstone?
I can't say I do, Miss Cottrell. I've never been the superstitious type.
You should research the matter, Dr. Bernstone. You really should. You're a psychologist after all. Shouldn't someone in your position be open to stuff like this, even if it doesn't align with your textbooks that enabled you to qualify as a psychologist in the very first place? Curses are real, Dr. Bernstone. I've read stories about them. Do you know they say that there were curses on the pharaoh's tombs to protect the pharaoh's things, so that if anyone dared break into those tombs, they would be afflicted with tragedy. And that happened to anyone that entered Tutankhamun's tomb. When they discovered it first, bad things happened to those people. It's a documented fact. It was a real curse.
Why do you think your family is cursed, Lisa?
Dr. Bernstone asked me tentatively. I could see that doubtful look in his eyes that suggested he thought the idea that my family had been locked under a curse was superstitious stuff and nonsense. But I would have expected any academic with a fancy degree like his to feel this way, so I wasn't exactly surprised by his dismissive gestures. Yet despite his doubt, I continued on with my conversation. I might as well tell him my feelings. That was the reason I was here after all, wasn't it? If you must know, Dr. Bernstone, my mother, when she was alive, confided in me a lot about a curse that this woman called Anna inflicted on our family. She was absolutely terrified about it. My father, of course, didn't believe a word about it. He was a perennial cynic like I expect you are. But I knew the curse was real.
How so?
Asked Dr. Bernstone, who I could see was probably humouring me as I spoke. He was likely thinking I was as nutty as a fruitcake or completely off my trolley. But surprisingly enough, I didn't care a jot about that. I didn't care what he thought about me, or anyone else for that matter. When you lose your family in a tragic accident like I did, not that I ever believed any of their deaths were accidental, you get a brand new sense of perspective about things, and you realise that what really matters is those you loved and lost. If Dr. Bernstone thought I was a raging lunatic, then so be it. I didn't care a jot. I knew what I had to tell him would certainly get his undivided attention, but whether he believed what I told him was highly debatable. It all started, Dr. Bernstone, when my mother fell out with her Haitian friend Anna. She'd been very close to this woman. I didn't know Anna terribly well. She came around to the house on several occasions for dinner. I never liked her very much. There was something about her that made my skin crawl. My mother and her friend Anna chose to start up a jewellery business together, against my father's seasoned advice. Then they had a very big falling out. My mother claimed Anna had been stealing a lot of the merchandise from her, and although the business was doing well, there were all these discrepancies. My mother confronted Anna about it, and she knew her friend was bleeding their successful business dry with her excessive pilferaging. Of course, when she confronted her friend about this matter, it didn't go down terribly well with Anna. Actually, Anna physically attacked my mother, pulled her hair, called her nasty names, and gave her a black eye. That was the beginning of the end of her relationship with Anna, my mother's relationship with her, I mean, which is why you don't go into business with your friends, Dr. Bernstone, if you can possibly help it.
I agree with you wholeheartedly on that, Lisa. It's not a good idea to go into business with friends of any kind. So I take it from what you're saying that this woman Anna was seeking revenge on your mother, was she? Is that what you're saying?
That's exactly what I'm saying, Dr. Bernstone. My mother said after Anna had beaten her up, the woman stormed out on her, spitting in my mother's face. She was screaming, "How dare you accuse me of being a thief? You're going to be sorry for what you've done. No one calls me a thief and gets away with it. I'm going to put a curse on you that will wipe your family out, and you aren't going to be able to do a damn thing about it. In my culture, we know how to put people like yourself directly in their place. My friend, you're really going to regret messing around with me." You see, Dr. Bernstone, my mother knew Anna meant every word she said. You see, when she began working with Anna in their jewellery business, she discovered to her horror that Anna was heavily into voodoo and stuff like that. But then voodoo is a religion for many Haitian people. And it's something that they do all the time. They will sacrifice animals for their gods, things like that. She told my mother once she'd been sexually abused by a family relative of hers many long years ago. So she paid someone to put a hex on this man, and the following week he was dead. My mum was shocked when Anna told her this story, and I mean really shocked. It made her nervous about being in Anna's company. It would seem that she had no remorse for what she'd done to this man. When Anna told my mother she'd put a curse on our family, let's just say my mother was in a right state about it all. She really believed that our family was soon to be cursed. 2 weeks later, 5 different car accidents occurred in our family. My mother and father both lost their parents on both sides of the family. My mother lost a sister and a brother, and my dad lost his brother, all in bizarre freak car accidents over a 2-week period. And this is not normal, Dr. Bernstone, not by any stretch of the imagination. I'm sure even you can agree to that.
You are right about that, Lisa. There is nothing normal about losing 7 of your family members in 5 freak car accidents over a 2-week period. Nothing normal at all about that. I can't imagine what you've been through. That must have been very distressing for you and your parents.
You better believe it was devastating for us all. My father took the news a little better than my mother did, but then again he's always been a tough, very resilient man. My mother was beside herself with grief, having to attend 5 funerals for 7 people over 2 weeks, all caused from different car accidents. How does that even happen, Dr. Bernstone? Unless you're living in a war zone, of course. I personally do not believe in coincidences, Dr. Bernstone. I'm sorry, but I just don't. How can 7 family members die at once in a 2-week period? It's insane. Absolutely insane.
I agree with you. It's nonsensical, as you say. Your family members were practically wiped out in a 2-week time period, in 5 separate accidents. You are believing that this Haitian woman Anna, who worked with your mother in the start-up jewelry business, really did put a curse on your family, and she is responsible for the demise of these people.
I nodded. I know Anna put a curse on my family, Dr. Bernstone. I just know she did. There can be no other explanation for 7 deaths occurring in the course of a 2-week period. There just can't be. I haven't even told Dr. McGregor about this, because it sounds so ludicrous. In truth, I don't know why I'm telling you any of this, Dr. Bernstone. I had no intention of divulging this information to anyone. I didn't want to speak of such things again. But I am glad to be sharing this with someone, because it's been getting to me of late. Let's just say shortly before these family members of mine died, they complained they were having similar haunting, dark, lucid dreams. When they told this to my mother, she literally freaked out. She told me all about it, as my father never believed in the power of voodoo and things like that. He thought stuff like that was all hocus-pocus stuff and nonsense. I knew differently, of course. And so did my mother. Me and my mother were incredibly close. We were the best of friends. She knew that I would listen to her. I guess she needed to confide in someone, like I'm confiding in you. And she knew I wouldn't think she was going crazy. That's why she told me everything.
I don't think you're crazy, Lisa, if it helps to hear that. So you're saying that these family members of yours experienced the same nightmares shortly before they died? I find that very interesting indeed.
That's right, Dr. Bernstone. These dreams were uncannily similar, if you can call them dreams at all. I think a better description for them would be nightmares, lucid nightmares. It would seem most of these family members of mine experienced what they called a visitation from a dark entity, a winged creature with horns on his head, and menacious red eyes. This insidious creature seemed to appear to them in their REM state. It was vile and demonic, like something regurgitated from the bowels of hell itself. It appeared to be tormenting them, and they were filled with a sense of impending doom, even when they awoke from their dream, as if in some way they felt threatened by it. My grandmother told my mother she was sure that this demonic creature was going to kill her, so she had a sense about her demise even before she died. Most of these family members of mine, Dr. Bernstone, put these lucid nightmares down to being just that, a simple nightmare. They just thought there was nothing more to it. But I think they were trying to console themselves, like you do, when you don't want to think about anything too much. But they were very disquieted and disturbed by these dreams, or nightmares, so to speak, describing the experience as hauntingly real and terrifyingly scary. Shortly after these so-called nightmare events, all 7 of these family members of mine died, in 5 separate freak car accidents. It sounds like a bizarre horror movie, doesn't it, Dr. Bernstone? But it's absolutely true. I believe my mother's vindictively evil Haitian friend Anna did something to our family. I don't understand the Haitian culture, but she obviously knew someone who knew how to unleash voodoo spells and tap into the demonic realm to conjure up evil spirits to curse my family. Rather like the Grim Reaper, I expect. I believe, Dr. Bernstone, my mother's vindictively evil friend Anna did something. Now, I don't understand the Haitian culture at all, but this girl Anna obviously knew someone who knew how to unleash voodoo spells and to tap into the demonic realm, to call up and conjure up evil spirits to curse my entire family, rather like the Grim Reaper. I believe this winged monster, whatever in God's name it was, took these family members of mine out over a 2-week period and managed to make their deaths appear to be tragic accidents. But that's how the evil one works, Dr. Bernstone. If you ask any Catholic exorcist, they'll tell you how demons operate and how real they are. Let me tell you, dealing with voodoo opens up the portals into our world from hell itself. Since my family all died, I've made a study of these things, and it has not made for easy reading, I assure you, Dr. Bernstone. You wouldn't believe the weird things that have happened to people who have been subjected to voodoo curses. Most of them have ended up dead.
For your information, it may be surprising for you to know that I do believe that demons exist,
said Dr. Bernstone, his face growing solemn and very grave. He was listening to my story intently, with his eyes steadily fixed on me. I knew I had captivated his undivided interest, and he was really taking into consideration that maybe my family had indeed been cursed by divination of some kind, and the idea, although seemingly wild, was plausible to him, and that pleased me greatly, because finally I had found a listening ear.
"Go on, Lisa," said Dr. Bernstone. "This is one of the most intriguing stories I've ever heard from one of my patients. Like you, Lisa, I'm struggling to explain all of this. The death of 7 of your family members in 5 separate car accidents over a 2-week period makes no sense at all. Furthermore, these people experience nightmares, a visitation from a winged creature with red eyes. This is extremely baffling. It's like your family all guessing the correct lottery numbers at the same time, for the jackpot, and we know that that never happens. It would seem your family all observed the strange winged creature, visiting them during their REM state, shortly before they died. And that in itself is revelatory.
When Dr. Bernstone said this to me, he seemed to be talking more to himself, rather than to me, as if he was trying to make sense of what I'd actually told him. I knew where he was coming from, because I had been in that place so very often myself. You're exactly right, Dr. Bernstone. They did.
I cannot say, Lisa, that I know anything about demons in particular. And you are right, when I qualified as a psychologist, subjects like this were never discussed. And they quite frankly should have been. The Church believes that some mental illnesses are related to demonic possession, and that would make perfect sense to me. I wish I knew more about this subject matter, but I'm afraid I don't. I'm not very well informed in that regard.
At this revelation from Dr. Bernstone, my jaw almost dropped to the ground. I had not expected my psychologist to say this. I was speaking to someone who really was understanding where I was coming from, and this was very refreshing indeed. And now I was glad that I'd come here. I was glad I'd listened to Dr. McGregor's advice. He was right. Dr. Bernstone was special. So there we are. That is the end of part 1 of our story. Part 2 is tomorrow night. I look forward to you joining me then. Until next time, goodbye and good night.